So, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to take a quick trip out to West Virginia. I got sick as a dog along the way, and I'm still recovering, but I think my voice is finally restored enough that I can make this video. So, some friends of mine had listened to a few things that I had shared with them about moving, and they kind of had their own thoughts about that as well. And the convergence of these was that my friend wanted to get a closer look at West Virginia as a potential place to move. And so he was going with his wife, and he invited me and my wife to come along. And I wasn't about to turn down a free trip to West Virginia, even though it was kind of a whirlwind trip. I thought it'd be a good chance to just have some time with my wife and with my friend and his wife, and turned out to be a nice trip in spite of getting sick. And so I wanted to share some of the information that I picked up while I was there with you. Now I have to apologize ahead of time. In retrospect, I definitely should have taken a bunch of pictures and video, but I wasn't going to make a video. I was going to help out my friend and to give him a second set of eyes and learn what I could for my own purposes as a potential place to move. So as most of you know, the future for where my family lives and what we're going to be doing is still up in the air. Everything I do on this channel, as well as the books, it's my full-time job at this point, and it's completely supported through donations. And so many of you have been, I should say some of you, have been very generous, and I appreciate that. And if you're on the fence, I encourage you to consider making a monthly recurring donation. It makes these things possible. And so if you find value in the books or the videos, if you'd consider making a recurring donation that reflects that value up to the point where it doesn't displace something more important, I'm very grateful for it. But being subject to the I guess, grace of other people is not always the most stable place to be. And so part of learning more about this place was to get information to inform our own options in the future, whether we end up selling our place and moving to a lower cost of living region, which West Virginia definitely fits that bill, or not. So here are some of the things that you'll find in West Virginia. I think first and foremost, it is either the lowest cost of living state in the country, or it's pretty darn close if it's not the lowest. Land is still very inexpensive there. It's similar to how it was in a lot of rural places before COVID. West Virginia still hasn't really been picked up by people as an option for where to move. And there are reasons for that, but they're not very good reasons. So in the pros list, what you'll find in West Virginia is a whole lot of green. And I went in at the end of January 2025 and was surprised to find out that you can graze animals year-round there. And depending on what you're growing, you can grow crops year-round. You could grow kale, for example, year-round in West Virginia. And if you have a greenhouse, you certainly could grow a lot more than that year-round. The climate is ideal for most crops and for most trees. And the trees matter because when you pick up acreage, there's only so much you can do as far as traditional crops. Most people without experience in homesteading, they only think about growing vegetables. And the truth is that vegetables are not the primary source of calories when you're growing your own food. You need grain. Or you need potatoes, but some kind of carb. West Virginia is not great for grain because what you don't have are flat fields. And this is actually shocking if you go check it out and you're not used to that sort of thing. It's a weird state as far as geography goes. It's just everything's a slope, everything. And this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to find a good property in West Virginia, because most of them are small And they're just these little triangles where two hills meet. And usually it's right along a creek or a river, and there's a lot of flooding that happens. Most of the roads run along these creeks and rivers. And so finding a place where you are not putting yourself in danger of a flood, and finding a place where you have acres of arable land, it's very challenging. But that's one of many things about West Virginia that I would call a joint pro and con, a plus and a minus at the same time. So where I live in western Montana, it was also considered a kind of an uninhabitable area by most people for a long time. And then with COVID, that changed for various reasons. But there are lots and lots of flat spots. And so people will populate these areas with homes. And the only thing that will stop them is either zoning or cost. And the cost has proven to be quite prohibitive. But in a place like West Virginia, there are geographical boundaries. There are geographical barriers to expansion. West Virginia is never going to be a high population state. It can't be, because there just isn't enough space. Most of the geography is uninhabitable. You can't even cut a road to get to a lot of these places. And so that's a pro and a con at the same time. So one of the benefits to moving to West Virginia is property appreciation. So if you were to look at a map, and I'm not sure there is such a map, but you could theoretically construct one, and you looked at potential for property appreciation, very few areas have a high potential because that ship has already sailed. The values of the land have already risen. There are a few exceptions to that. And West Virginia is one of them. In fact, I'd put it towards the top of the list because, like I said, there's still this huge barrier where people aren't really thinking about moving to West Virginia. And eventually that's going to change if home prices and land prices stay high. It has to. So it's kind of like water flowing downhill. People will seek out places with lower cost of living. And as they do, the benefits of these places will reduce relative to the costs. But for now, it's a real opportunity because a person who moved to a place like this, in 5 or 10 years, they're going to have a property that's worth double what they paid for it, easily, in all likelihood. So maybe that doesn't materialize, but it's very likely to, okay? So what are some other joint pros and cons about West Virginia? Well, I think the biggest issue is that there just aren't any jobs. And I mean, there are no jobs in West Virginia. The vast majority of the state is just random houses nestled in these cracks between hills. And the only reason anyone ever lived there in the first place was because of the coal mines. And most of the coal mining has been shut down. And so it's a state in decline economically, which that's not good for a lot of people. And for some people, it's really good. So if you have a job that's remote, then that's not a problem. And in fact, it's something you can leverage to get into a better situation. But another downside of this, which is also true of most rural areas, that suburban people and city people just are not used to, is you can't just pick up the phone and get somebody to come out and fix a problem that you have. This is a big issue if you're building a house as well. Don't think that you can go to a place like this and just call up contractors as if you're in some suburban area and get 3 bids and then the ground breaks on construction a week later. It's not going to happen. In fact, where I live, if I needed a plumber, I'd have to call 3 different places and I probably wouldn't even get one call back. And there's no way you can get a bid without them driving out, and then you're on the hook for mileage and time. So it's a very different world. And most people are not prepared for that because they've never been hands-on, do-it-yourself kind of people. And you have to be to live in a place like this. Because 9 times out of 10, if something goes wrong, you're the one that's going to have to fix it. If that's not something that you're interested in, and by interested in, I don't mean just sort of curious about, it's going to be worse than you think it is. And if you're not up for the challenge, you really don't want to move to a place like this. So there are some cool things about the place that you probably wouldn't know unless you've looked into it. For example, there are a lot of gas wells in West Virginia. It's not hard to find a property where the gas is being mined by some company, and so they have one or two pieces of equipment on the land, like a big tank or a pump, and you get free gas for life or until the well runs out. So that's kind of crazy. So if you want to use gas to heat your house or for your stove or for your hot water heater, it's all free until it runs out. And so a lot of people, they go their whole lives on this free gas. Now, what's interesting is that these properties are actually not that hard to find because folks in West Virginia don't like buying them. Why? Well, one is because they're poor and they don't have money to buy a house. But two is because they're very private people and they don't like the fact that the gas company comes out every month or whatever it is to check the pump or empty the tank or whatever it is that they do. And so most people couldn't care less about that. If you're used to a suburban area, you're still massively increasing your privacy by getting a place like this. But for folks who live in West Virginia, they see this as invasive and they're not interested for the most part. All right, so that's kind of a quick pass of what's nice about West Virginia. It is completely possible to find a 20, 50, or 100 acre lot, and in some cases, those lots are forested with hardwood trees. And there's a lot of variance, but you know, we lined up, I think we went to go see 3 properties while we were out there. And they're all on the large side. Before I went out, you might ask, what are some things that you learned that you didn't know? Because everything I'm saying here, I pretty much knew already. I was shocked by just how hilly it is. I grew up next door in Maryland, and there are plenty of flat spots in Maryland. I was quite surprised by how hilly it was. But I was also disabused of the notion. I really thought it'd be possible to find some really big property there and then subdivide it and then have multiple home sites on that property. And the geography just makes that really, really difficult. It's super hard to find any kind of property where doing that would work. And there are various reasons as to why. But the biggest is it's just not going to be a flat area. And so like one of the properties I looked at was kind of a bowl shape with a creek running through it. There are creeks everywhere. There's water everywhere, which is a great thing if you have livestock or you want to, or crops or whatever. But in this bowl property, you know, one of the thoughts was, well, maybe somebody could buy this and divide it up 3 ways. Well, if you do that in a little bowl, you're going to be like staring at your neighbors 24/7 because they're on the other side of the bowl and it's all pretty tight in there. And if you're going to move out into the middle of nowhere, you probably don't want to live on a highway. You probably don't want to see your neighbor's house, right? There are these rules where the trade-off has to include certain perks or it's not worth it. And at least in my book, if I'm going to move to a rural area, I want to reduce the number of neighbors' houses I can see. I want to be further from a highway than I would be in the suburbs, etc. So, who would West Virginia be ideal for? Well, I mentioned you have to have some way of making money. One of the fantasies for people who've never homesteaded before is that they think that they're going to somehow be able to market products to other folks. And I can say a lot about that. But just to keep it focused on West Virginia, it's one of these puzzles that's very hard to solve. You want to live in a rural area, but you need to live close enough to people to have a market to sell your goods. West Virginia does not solve that equation. It is just way too remote. The population density is super low, which is great for a lot of reasons. But if you want to start a business, whether that be doing farming stuff or not, your only hope is to ship things, is to have your customers not live close to you. And it has to work out that way. So odds are the only entrance that you'll have into a place like this is if you have a reliable remote job that pays well. Another thing that you'll probably want for the ideal kind of person for West Virginia is to have at least $250,000 in equity in your current home. Now, what's so magic about that? Well, that's kind of the price range to be able to buy a good chunk of land. It's going to be north of 100K. And so, again, you don't want to move into some remote area and buy 3 acres. You're going to want 10, 20, 50, 100 acres. And there are some exceptions, but for the most part, the land prices there are reliably reasonable in terms of what you get for the money. It's consistent the way they're priced across the state. For the most part, you might find an exception, a real good deal. But for the most part, if the land is worth having, it'll be more expensive than if it's not. And that's pretty reliable. So you'll need enough money to buy the land and also probably to move in there with a travel trailer, which climate-wise you can get by on, especially if you have free gas to heat the thing through the winter, until you can get a manufactured home delivered, which there's a lead time on those of at least a year usually. Get a well sunk, which a lot of these properties already have wells on them, although that doesn't mean you'd want to use the well that you have. You obviously want to check it out to see what the quality is. And then maybe even build the home, but like I said, that's probably not an option unless you're doing it yourself. And hopefully you wouldn't think about that unless you've got experience or some other reason to believe that that's something that you could handle. It would be really difficult. So anyway, you want a nice chunk of cash because one of the biggest benefits of moving to a place with a radically lower cost of living is that you can go from having a normal mortgage and the homeowner's insurance that goes with it to no mortgage. That can be an enormous difference in your financial outlook. But in order to do that, you have to find very inexpensive land and look at your all-in price to have a place to live in that area. But the ideal situation would be that you go from a normal suburban or city situation to owning a decent house. It probably won't be as big, but maybe it will be even bigger depending on where you're coming from. But a decent house on land and have it all paid off with no homeowner's insurance. And then you're saving money every single month you live there. And that would be a huge move up. And most of the time, people are only interested in moving if there's a really, really, really clear upside. So what would help with this is if you're interested in homesteading and you have a young family. A lot of times people fantasize about homesteading and they're kind of late in life. And there's just not a ton you can do as an old person on a homestead. That's just the facts of life. And a lot of people who've never done it before, they kind of fantasize about this, and then I think they're in for a rude awakening. There's a reason why historically this was always done by young families. You really need kid power to do these sorts of things. So if you fit that bill, then maybe you should take a look at West Virginia. Now, most of what I've said have been positive attributes of the potential of this place. There are some downsides. In my book, the biggest ones are that this is not an ideal place in the event of really terrible things happening. For example, a nuclear war or grid down event or some kind of military invasion, that sort of thing. The good news is maybe you don't think that those things are very likely or very close to happening. But the other good news is that even with all of that, like I said, it's a super low population density. It's absolutely terrible geographically to think about the logistics of getting an invading force through West Virginia. I think that would definitely be a spot where they just don't worry about it too much. It wouldn't be worth the cost of trying to go through. So compared to other places, it's still a million times better than most places where most folks live in the event of even these things. But in the event of life as we know it today, or a whole bunch of bad things, but not as bad as what I already talked about, a sort of soft collapse, if you will, this is a wonderful place to be, an absolutely wonderful place to be. Like I said, there's tons of flowing water, so it wouldn't be all that hard to find a place that you could throw a little water-powered electric generator into the creek or river. There's free gas, like I said, at a lot of these places. There's tons of wood everywhere. So wonderful place to heat your house with wood, to grow crops. It's one of the few places that you could absolutely grow all the food that you ate. And like I said, it's not ideal for grains just because you're not going to have 100 acres of flat fields. But you could definitely grow potatoes, and you could grow tons of fruit trees, nut trees, all sorts of stuff that, I was daydreaming the whole time out there about all the different things I could plant there that I can't plant in western Montana. It's really ideal as far as climate goes for growing. So, and you get 4 seasons. You still have a winter, you have a spring, and those of you who've only lived in the Rockies don't know anything about fall or spring. They're actual seasons in the mid-Atlantic, not just a figment of your imagination or like 2 days. So, anyway, if it's of interest to you to check that place out, feel free, if you have questions or comments, to drop them here in the video, or you can always email me. But I do believe that this would be an ideal move for at least some people, as long as they fit the criteria that I talked about. So I hope that this helps. I went out there so that you don't have to, and got pretty sick doing it. But hopefully you avoid this flu that's going around this winter. It's pretty terrible. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I hope that you wrap this information into your thinking process when it comes to the potential of moving. And just to say one more thing about that, there are so many options in life that people just aren't thinking about because it's different from what they are doing and different from what all the people they know are doing. But that doesn't mean it's not better. There are so many better things out there, better choices out there, better options that people just aren't thinking about. And it takes a certain kind of weirdo to dig these options up and present them to people. But it's a matter of faith. Faith as I define it in my book, Through Faith. And it's a very different way of thinking about life, but it's a very important way of thinking about life. I mean, let's suppose that these criteria that we went over fit your situation. And let's just imagine that you're living in an $800,000 house right now, and maybe you've got $250,000 in equity or a little bit more, and you've got a mortgage that's thousands of dollars a month, and you live in this little postage stamp yard, and it's terrible, and your kids are anxious and depressed, and they just play video games all the time or do after-school sports or whatever. You could live in an absolutely gorgeous place, absolutely gut your monthly expenses, and just have an all-around million times better life. And the option's right there. So if it fits for your situation, go for it.